what makes Australia and the US stronger than the UK is the amount of land, the natural resources that they can feed themselves. I mean, look, if the whole world trade economy ended tomorrow, Australia and the United States would be two countries that would come out best.
Well, this conversation comes from Chapman University in Los Angeles, and it's with Joel Kotkin, who I've spoken to before, but has been really piling up some fantastic articles, which I think tell us some really important things about what's happening to our society and why we need to be more alert and, frankly, more engaged. Now, he's been described by the New York Times as America's uber-geographer. Joel is an internationally recognised authority on global economic, political and social trends. He's the Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at this university, Chapman, and Executive Director of the Urban Reform Institute, as well as being the author of 7 previously published books. His latest book is The Coming of Neo-Feudalism. Joel's a contributor to Forbes.com, to the City Journal, the Daily Beast, Quillette, proudly edited by an Australian, American Affairs, Real Clear Politics, and Unheard. Good international flavour there. Joel, just first up, the thing that strikes me about you, you're not coming from a political or a philosophical extreme. I think it would be fair to say, essentially, you're a pragmatic centralist.
Yes.
And yet you're seeing really troubling developments that we need to be more alert to.
Well, I tend to think of myself as something of a Fabian, in the sense that not necessarily like Beatrice Webb, but a person who says, let's see what works. And if the social solution works, I'm okay with it. If the free market solution works, I'm okay with it. Let's just find out what works. What I find astounding is that you have people who will defend policies as this is social justice. I said, but wait, California is the epitome of social justice. We have the highest poverty rate in the United States. We have the highest level of illiteracy in the United States. How is that progressive? But what we have is it's almost like a postmodernist world where what you say, what your intentions are, is all that matters, as opposed to what actually happens. Now, I happen to come from a background where, my mother was a nurse, my father was a doctor and taught in medical school. I always thought, well, I want to know what the results are. If this treatment has bad effects, I don't want to do it anymore. But it's not what your intention is, it's what the results are. And we have completely lost that aspect. And by the way, it's not just the people on the left. One of the reasons the conservatives do so badly is that many of them are into this sort of libertarian ideology. They don't care what the effect is on other people. One of my biggest critiques on libertarians are they want to have policies which will, in many cases, mean that people can't own homes because capital goes in and buys all the single family homes and either makes them denser or rents them out. I said, if you don't have a population of small homeowners and small business people, you're going to end up with some form of socialism in the long run. Because why should a young person who has never going to buy a house, never going to make much money, never going to get married, never going to have kids, why should that person do anything but vote for Bernie Sanders? Bernie's going to give you rent control. He's going to subsidize your education. Why would you vote for a conservative who's just going to keep you poor?
Yeah. Well, you wrote an article, Welcome to the End of Democracy, back in January. And I commend it to people. I really do. You can Google it. Joel Kotkin, Welcome to the End of Democracy. A rising tide of money and administrative power defines the rising autocracy. So can you give us a bit of a recap of your concept of neo-feudalism? Okay. Firstly, what is feudalism? So we bandy so many terms around now. You're teaching a lot of young people. Most of them probably never heard.
You have that. You've got right. I've been in front of a class and there'd be 30 people and maybe 2
Yeah.
It's not the kids' fault.
No.
It's what they come out of high school with so little knowledge. I mean, I've had students say to me, "Well, during World War II, didn't we fight the Chinese?" I said, "No, we fought the Japanese, actually." I mean, and again, I think but here's where I see the parallels with feudalism, and obviously, there's nobody going around with chain mail and on horses. One, you have the concentration of wealth and power. That was one of the essences of the feudal era.
Yep.
That very few people controlled pretty much everything.
No middle class.
Very small, struggling middle class with no rights, particularly.
And then a few peasants.
Right. Well, there were a lot of peasants, and and they had even fewer rights. You also have this sort of religious fundamentalism. Now, the religious fundamentalism of today is not Christianity, although there are some who have that. The fundamentalism is more environmental, gender, race. Those have become the new religions, and there's no room for dissent. To have a good discussion on what we should do on climate change is as unlikely as expecting a bunch of bishops in 900 to have a discussion about the nature of Christ. I mean, it's that so there's sort of this inflexibility. Then this is interesting. Demographically, particularly Western societies all have very low birth rates and are, in many cases, are headed towards a diminished population. That's also the Middle Ages. We went through about 1,000 years where the world population didn't even grow.
We might come to energy in a moment because, of course,
Yes.
energy's been a big part of what's let it grow.
Right.
But can we unpack? This is what really jumped out at me. So there's some of the things you've been referring to. There's this concentration of power and wealth at a time when most Western economies, productivity stalled, real wages have been flatlining or even falling.
Yeah, certainly since the inflation, for sure.
Squeezing out those middle classes and the working classes. But at the top, so just some of your numbers are, I think here we go. 5 years ago, you write, around 400 billionaires owned as much as half of the world's assets. Half, 5 years ago. Today, only 100 billionaires own that share. And some estimates are that it's even less than 100. And there's a surprising parallel. China's much the same.
Yes.
Or more so.
Oh, yeah. China's now more unequal than the United States.
In a communist country where everybody's equal.
Right.
And nobody has private property.
Well, of course, that's not the case. The difference in China is your private property can be taken from you at any moment. And, I'm sure we'll work on it too.
So this astonishing wealth, hardly good for social harmony in a free country like America, in my country like Australia. When particularly the policies, Joel, we've been pursuing since the GFC, then through COVID, let's not go into the rights and wrongs on, now with climate, all of them, in my judgment, create more and more serious problems for younger people and poorer people.
Yes, definitely.
If you take the GFC and COVID, it's very easy to see. We were pursuing inflationary targets that were designed. There was a hope for inflation. We couldn't get it. Free money everywhere, cheap money everywhere. It made the wealthy wealthier, the poor and the young couldn't get a start. COVID, everybody's documented how we've built up debts that young people are going to inherit.
And of course, the terrible effects on education.
Climate change. The policies that these squillionaires out of the tech giants and those sorts of backgrounds, the policies that they are leaning on governments to provide. In fact, you would argue that government and those squillionaires are becoming inseparable. That's part of the problem.
That's clearly what's happened.
But they count against the middle classes, against young people, against the less well off.
Right, but the problem is that they also control much of the media.
Yeah.
And now you have, and it's come out quite well recently, that companies like Facebook and Twitter, are in direct contact with the CDC or the EPA, the environmental agency or the people in charge with dealing with COVID, and they are literally censoring those things that the government officials don't think are good. I mean, it's there's, I mean, and of course, one of the more outrageous ones was obviously the Hunter Biden thing, which Zuckerberg recently admitted. He said you know, the FBI agents told us that it was Russian misinformation. No, it turned out to be completely accurate. But so I think that the problem is that what you've got is a confluence of interests. Now, by the way, the clerisy and the oligarchs will have their fights. That will happen. Just like during the Middle Ages, there were many conflicts between even the bishops and the kings. That's one of the constant tensions in medieval history. Well, we'll see that eventually. Right now, those two classes have to work together because they're united in their opposition to, to the Trump people and to the Republicans in general, and against a lot of the middle class. But it's very, very difficult to see how we're going to get out of this particular pattern, because I think that when you look at the control of media, the universities, the cultural institutions, it's pretty one-sided. I'm not sure if it's the same in Australia, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Trending in the same line, very much so. Interestingly, we have more kids in the private sector, non-state educative sector. 90% of American school children go to state schools, as I understand it.
But that's also changing. A lot of growth in charter schools, a lot of growth in private schools, a lot of growth in homeschooling.
What does that say?
What the polls will tell you, if you look at Gallup, the belief in the institutions is at one of the lowest levels in the history of this country. Certainly since Gallup has been doing polls. They don't trust the universities, they don't trust the media, they don't trust the presidency, they don't trust the Congress, and they don't trust big business. That's all. And now they're increasingly skeptical of education. This whole business where we're trying to create sort of standards in education that are that have to follow the party line, if you will. That's very, very painful. I'm very proud that Chapman is one of the schools that I think has, to a large extent, stood up against that. But it's a terrible tide, and when the older teachers are gone and the younger ones who've been brought up in the system inherit, it will be a little bit difficult.
Yeah, the stats on the move in academia amongst professors, teachers, academic staff from roughly half and half only 30 years ago of either side of the sort of centrist line politically, to where it's overwhelmingly one side.
And it's a very different one side. I would say a lot of things I would say I'm left. I was certainly brought up left of center.
This is the value of your perspective. You're not coming from either of those extremes.
Right. And what I see is that many of my friends who are liberals and Democrats, but are horrified by what's going on. They're horrified by, policies that are clearly hurting middle and working class people. The sort of the demand of orthodoxy. I always thought, it's a good thing to have a debate. It's a good thing to disagree. Once the term "the science is settled," that is one of the more dangerous phrases. Science is settled is sort of like God has spoken.
Except the science is never settled.
Of course, it shouldn't be settled. I remember my father, who was quite a person studying in the sciences and medical sciences, and he once said, who killed the most people in the world? Doctors, because he said, what I learned as a medical student in Boston in the 1930s, that stuff killed people. We didn't know. We were just doing things that we didn't know would have that effect. So you change over time, as and we don't. We look at things that aren't working. Like a perfect case that's very current, and I think will be current in Australia. You cut out all fossil fuels and you get rid of nuclear power. Then you decide that you're going to have everybody drive an EV. What do you think is going to happen? I had a wonderful discussion with a young guy who was a PhD engineering student at Stanford. He called me. He was asking me about EVs, and then he said to me, I said, well, he said, well, what do you think about the energy side of it? And he said, I'm told not to ask that question.
Really?
Yeah.
We'll come back to EVs because I think it's another area where you can feel, you've just alluded to it, you can feel where the debate's going. It'll be all left brain thinking. It'll be all emotively driven. You won't be allowed to question it. We'll come back to that just for a moment. There's two other aspects of what you wrote in this brilliant paper that I'm suggesting to everybody that if they haven't read it, get onto it. One is that young people know how bad things are getting. And
their parents know too.
Yeah, they do. It was very interesting for me. I was talking to a scientist I respect in Australia recently, and he said, oh, it's because, of course they're depressed. They don't think Australia's doing anything about climate change. So I went and talked to a demographer who, our best, in my judgment, in Australia, what was worrying young people. It's a multiplicity of things. It's not just climate change. It's partly that we snuff all the enthusiasm for life out, and we tell them if this doesn't get you, that's going to get you. You've got no hope, climate change is going to destroy you. Instead of saying life's a challenge, you've got to go and tackle it. But there's two things that I just want to explore very briefly. One is, you make the point that many young people feel they'll never own their own home unless they inherit one.
Right. That's at least in this country. And Piketty and Thomas, the Piketty, the French economist, Marxist, basically, he says same things happening in Europe, Germany, France, countries even that have somewhat social democratic systems. The same things are happening. Young people simply are unable to accumulate their own wealth, so that the key now is you make your fortunes by the old-fashioned way you inherit it. And
in fact, I actually recently quoted you. You've noted that in Australia it's particularly bad, the drop-off in young people being able to afford homes.
Oh yeah, I mean, and then of course there are other effects of that. People don't own homes, therefore their political views change. Plus they don't
family
have
formation is a problem.
They don't have children. I mean, we're looking at drops in fertility rates. We look at them and say, you're talking about some countries down to like 1.14, and which is the replacement rate is about 2.1.
Yeah.
We're talking about countries being half to a third of replacement rate, and countries like Australia, which used to be. Here's my image of Australia. I went to Perth once. I got picked up by the driver at the airport. And we were driving along. So, where do you live? He pointed up the hill and said, I own 2 houses up there. And I said, that's a great country. It's a great country where a guy who's making his living with a chauffeur service is able to own a house and live in a nice neighborhood. And that's what a social democrat should be looking at. How do we make life look better? And what's happened is those of us who are the old social democrats, Mike Lind, me, Roy Teixeira, we're no longer part of the Democratic Party because they're not really interested in those issues. And the environmental thing is a key element of that, because if you want to say it, well, really, we should have less children. People should have less space. They shouldn't have cars, and they should live like the good serfs that they should be.
I'll pick that up in a moment, because it's just one other thing here that I think it goes to this heart of the squeezing out of the middle and lower classes. You say that COVID in particular, but other economic policies are killing small business.
Yes.
So increasingly, it's the big oligarchs, the tech companies, the whatevers. There's two comments out of that. One is that the business sector used to be ballast.
Right.
In healthy democracies.
Particularly the small property owning class.
Yeah. Now, the businesses that would still be ballast economically and socially are being squeezed out of business. They're disappearing. But the billionaires, they're not ballast in our society. Many of them want to tip it upside down.
Right.
And you've written about this. I think it's an interesting point.
And I think, part of it is, frankly, a lot of them, they're engineers, and they just don't understand how societies work. I have a good friend who was the largest developer of apartments in Silicon Valley. And he said to me, I've worked with oil companies, I've worked with finance companies, I've worked with all sorts of companies. The group the tech group is the ones who have the least understanding of the impact of what they're doing. They don't understand how human beings function, how societies function, and they tend to have this belief that there is a technological solution, if you will. And of course, their value system, and I write about this in the book, their value system is, well, I'm smart, I went to Caltech, I went to MIT, of course I should be telling people what to do. You know, so they've been brought up in this system where they feel that they are, you know, in a way it's a parallel with in the Middle Ages where it was whoever was the best fighter, whoever could win the most, you know, battles. And now it's the people who gain control over the internet and gain control over finance. And with the concentration, you know, we have to remember there hasn't been really in the last 10 to 15 years a true mega company rising. It's the same group, same 5, 6 companies. And then there are the ones on the side that come and go, you know, and they have different trajectories. But the amount of control that a Google, Apple, Microsoft, well, now it's called Meta, you know, Facebook. These people have a degree, Amazon, obviously, they have a degree of control we've never seen, you know, because our everyday lives are run by these companies.
The amount they know about us too.
It's unbelievable.
And building all the time. They'll soon be able to predict where you and I are likely to go next. Right. And who we're likely to mix with next, and what sort of meals we like, and, you know, what sort of state of mind we're in.
I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen those little things that the Amazon has where you know people put in their houses and it follows you around. Or what sort of imbecile wants Google to know what's in my refrigerator? I really don't want them to know.
Yeah.
And that's a scary thing with the young people now. Don't really have the value of privacy because they've been brought up in a world where everything is shared. And sometimes I'll talk to my own kids and I'll say, hey, you know what? Keep that to yourself. You don't have to share that with the rest of the world. You can share it with your friends. You can share it with us. You know, I am so reluctant to give out any personal information because, you know, that could be used against me. And you know, frankly, it's none of your business. That was, and you know, and as an American, I'm very proud of, you know, our traditions and, you know, don't tread on me. And part of don't tread on me is what is private to me is mine. It's not yours. It's not yours to analyze. It's not yours to take advantage of.
Now, Joel, to come to the whole issue of how we're handling climate, if I can nip right back to the mid-70s, I'm a young Australian fresh out of school, and I find myself sitting in lectures being given by an American, very high quality teaching, I've got to say. I have no idea where his politics would have lain. Isn't that an incredible thing?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know. Wouldn't have known then, still couldn't guess now. Anyway, it was an admirable American. One day he said to the class, do you know what lifeboat ethics are? Lifeboat ethics? None of us had any idea. Anyway, in essence, to cut to the chase, it was the view of emerging cutting-edge Greens environmentalists of the day that the greatest challenge to Mother Earth was that there are too many of us.
Right.
And
that's
we would
population bomb.
We'd have to cut our numbers, and someone would have to make some very hard decisions about who stayed in the boat and who was thrown overboard. And he said, what do you think it'd be worse? One of the ones to be thrown overboard or one of the ones who made the decision to throw someone else out? And obviously you're a monster if you're going to make those sort of decisions. Why do I refer to that all that time ago? I think we can see this emerging again with the absolute single-minded, we've offended Mother Earth. We humans are the enemy of the earth. Without mercy, you know, we must sacrifice ourselves, which somehow never seems to mean the biggest agitators for climate change as they fly around in their jets. Somebody else is going to, there's too many of us. Aren't we seeing a return of a sophisticated version of lifeboat ethics?
Oh, yeah. Look, what you have is first of all, this has been there for a long time. You know, if you go into the history of the environmental movement, very early on, it was the Rockefellers, it was the Ford Foundation. It was the people who owned Fiat, the Agnelli family, that did the limits to growth. I mean, basically, this has come from the high level. And look, I've had quotes from members of the royal family, members of Jacques Cousteau, basically saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we had some sort of virus that killed half the population of the world?" I mean, they literally say things like that. Or, the idea that people shouldn't aspire to own a house and have a backyard. I mean, the whole idea is so anti-human. Now, my feeling is, if you want to deal with climate change and you want to have it work in the long run, you got to do it in ways that people can deal with it over time. You don't cut their electricity. If you have to use nuclear power, you use nuclear power. You push things like remote work so that people don't have to commute. That's something that people like, and you can have real results. But the problem is that it's not just an idea of how do we save the planet, how do we reduce emissions. California, we did a little study on this. With all our policies, we've chased out so much industry and so many people. Then when those people move to Arizona or to Texas, their footprint is much bigger than it was here. Because one thing is, it's been hot the last few days, but generally speaking, we have a very mild climate and we tend to have relatively low usage. So, for instance, if my wife and our family moved to Houston, our carbon footprint would double right away, because we'd have to run the air conditioner for 6 months of the year. We probably would live in a more distant location. And the problem is that what it's become is virtue signaling. It's not, hey, you know what? It's better for Australia to produce cleaner fossil fuel energy than have it done in China. But we don't make that because our goal is to prove that Australia reduced its emissions by X%. Aren't we great? Well, it's global warming. It's not Australian warming. If we could take care of the climate change by what we did in our individual countries, that would be a different thing. But clearly, China is now emitting more GHG than the EU and the US put together.
And here's, because I'm glad you say that, because where's the critical thinking, including, I have to say, amongst young people? You teach them. I made the point to a bunch of young people in Australia the other day that they're probably on board with the green thinking in Australia. We should stop our extractive industries.
Right.
Well, while ever China's building 170 new coal-fired power stations, and Indonesia 56, and India 45, and Vietnam 11, they're trying to lift people out of poverty. That's not a bad goal in itself.
Same thing in Africa.
Africa,
South Africa in particular.
You're going to be better off exporting Australian energy. Well, not all of our coal is cleaner, but most of it is, than coal that's going to be used out of Indonesia or China. And it was a novel thought to these young people. I hadn't thought of it like that.
Well, because they've been taught that and of course they'll make the point. Well, the Western societies created all the carbon and all that. Okay, first of all, climate change was happening before the carbon. Now it may have made it worse, which I'm not a scientist, but I could accept that may be a factor. But climate has been a formative thing way before we had cars. If you read Karl Harper's great book, The Fate of Rome, he talks about Rome almost as if when there was the warm period, Rome did great. When it got cold, it began to decline. These things have been happening. There's the Little Ice Age. There's a lot of other things going on. People don't have the whole picture, and therefore they have a very simplistic idea. Like everything was ideal until this. Well, there were things happening before. There was this thing we had here in this country called the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, in the 30s.
In the 30s, temperatures were hotter. It was drier. We had a drought here in California in the 19th century, which was so bad that they were considering abandoning the city of Los Angeles because
Really?
there was no water left.
There was a drought in Australia in the 12th century that went for 37 years.
Really?
Yes,
See?
the scientists tell us. Now, I don't want to sound like a climate skeptic, a change skeptic, because I'm not. It is changing. I'm a farmer. I'm at the interface, of business,
Right.
my livelihood, or my family's livelihood, and climate. So it's important. But it's the way in which you're not allowed to debate the way forward in the things that we've just said. Another classic example is that I think the international accounting system's wrong. So Mr. Olaf, in Sweden, thinks that because Volvos are no longer made there, Sweden is doing better. Its numbers look better because Volvos are not being made there. They're made in China and then taken back to Sweden.
Right.
But Sweden's getting a lopsided accounting number, as I understand, out of it because it wasn't made there. Still consumed there.
Well, that's also, I mean, what we have here in California is we've chased out industry, but we still buy the stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
so consumption rather than production.
Right. But you see,
might be a better way of measuring it.
But I think definitely a better way of measuring it. But the problem is that you have in a place like California, what you do is you chase out industry. This was what may happen to Australia. It certainly happened in the UK. They're trying to turn around now, but once you begin to destroy your industrial base, which includes natural resource industries and even agriculture, then there's no lobby for those interests anymore. That's what's happened in California. Outside of the tech industry, there's the public employees and the tech industry. Nobody else has any influence anymore, because you've taken a state of California which had a huge industrial base, and you've essentially gutted it to the point that it's a fraction of what it was, and therefore there's no. I mean, you're a politician or a former politician, recovering politician,
a survivor.
A survivor, that's right. Or you've been through the 12-step program. but the reality is that what you have is you don't have the lobbies like here in California. Agriculture just doesn't have the power it used to have.
Yeah.
And then you start getting things which I think as a farmer, like, first of all, on the question of how you deal with climate change, the main thing is you have to adapt. You have to, how do we best adapt? I don't want to hear, there's going to be this huge surge in the sea level, which, so far has not happened, but let's say it happened. Well, then prepare for it. If you're going to have to change the crops because the climate's gotten warmer, maybe you plant something different. What we're doing now, I mean, with part of this extremism, you'll being a farmer, you'd be interested in this, the whole war on nitrates.
Yeah.
And then the attempts in the Netherlands, in part financed by Bill Gates, to wipe out the Dutch agriculture industry. One of the most efficient industries in the world is in the Netherlands. The Netherlands are particularly gifted in that area. You wipe that out. Now, what
Sri Lanka?
Sri Lanka is a great example. If yes, you can get rid of nitrates, but you're going to have to then you're going to lose half of your productivity.
Half of the globe's grain production is dependent upon that. At this stage, we don't have the alternative technologies. It's worth just recapping. Everybody's focused on electricity, which we'll come back to in a moment in California. It's a pretty interesting scenario you're facing. But you've got electricity, you've got ammonia, which is fertilizer, critical to feeding people with today's technologies. And you've got cement and you've got steel. Just one way of looking at it. Now, actually, cement and steel production will have to go up in pursuit of the nirvana in the short term anyway.
Right.
If you're going to build all these wind farms and what have you. So there's a bunch of really difficult issues in there. And you talk about their need to adapt. I'm constantly hearing in Australia as though it's like, as you said, it's a pronouncement, the science is settled, or this is what the science says. But policy is being formulated on the basis that the surveys show that 50% of Australians think we produce between 10 and 20% of the world's emissions. Tiny little Australia.
Oh, God.
In fact, in net terms, it's 1.1 now. It's coming down.
Well, it's like California, where, if California went into the ocean tomorrow, it would have no effect. I mean, China's increase in a month is bigger than what California does.
And the point I want to draw out of that is that as a farmer, regardless of how I feel about climate change, I know I will have to adapt if I'm going to continue producing food for people,
Right.
because our chief scientist has told us that nothing Australia does will make any significant difference. But that is not the mindset. That is not penetrated. So people are thinking with the left side of the brain, the emotive side of the brain, if I can put it that way, not the rational side, which leads me, if I can, to California. You yourself have called the Democrats' party's green energy policy here a man-made disaster. And in your home state, you're going to ban gas and petrol-powered vehicles altogether by 2035. Is that sale or ban?
You're going to, by 2035, you won't be able to. But before that, what's going to be really interesting is before that, they're starting to say, like, it's got to be 30% EVs within like 2-3 years. Well, you're talking about 5% now. So exactly how are you going to get 30% EVs in this market? The bottom line is what you're going to do is, I think the long-term policy is EVs will be an elite thing that will go back to the 20s when only wealthy people drove cars, and the rest of us will either work at home, use ride-hailing services, take the bus. That will be all alternatives. That the days where, a working class guy in East LA could have a car, I think that's what they want to get rid of. Now, I personally believe that if you come to California in 2040, I won't be around, but let's say if you go to California in 2040, it may be like Cuba with a lot of old cars that have been maintained for years and years and years. I mean, that's the other thing is what's going to happen is that people are going to buy cars, prior to 2035, and they're going to hold on to them because particularly, I would say the Japanese cars and the Korean cars, they're going to last for 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. And let's tease this out a little bit more. You're getting warnings now, texts coming up on your phone saying, please reduce your power usage, electricity. You switch to an EV fleet, the higher the numbers go, the more electricity you need. And where's that going to come from?
Well, the problem...
Or is it your point, people are going to stop driving?
Well, I think that's what they really want to happen for lots of reasons. They've been trying to get rid of the car.
They being?
The clerisy.
Yeah.
A lot of the academic media, nonprofit think tank people.
So this is a bit like lifeboat ethics. They don't actually want to tell you what they really think.
Oh no, the great thing about the British Greens is they actually say what they think. Like the guy at the Guardian saying, "Oh, I really hope there's a bad recession that will reduce the emissions." Another crazy Brit wrote something about, well, the war is really good because it will slow the world economy. You sit there and you say, what planet did you come from? Were you ever brought up by your parents? Did they ever teach you any values, that you're not supposed to, purposely hurt people? I mean, I was brought up from, family that, my father was the first one to go to college, and my mother grew up in the slums of Brooklyn. I mean, as she said, a crappy neighborhood then, a crappy neighborhood now. And the values I was brought up is, I don't think about, when I think about, let's say, climate, how do I address climate change in a way that doesn't hurt people, that makes it possible for life to go on in a decent way? And there's, do we want to invest in those technologies that might allow us to do that? But that's not the goal of the environmental movement. The goal of the environmental movement is basically, I think, to immiserate the vast majority of people. I mean, they would never think that, they wouldn't say it consciously, but that's what their policies are doing, and they simply don't care. A friend of mine, Jennifer Hernandez, who's an attorney, sued the state of California on behalf of 200 civil rights leaders here. And Jennifer went to, with Becerra, who's now the health secretary, which is, God, a bizarre choice. But anyway, And she said, well, don't you think this is hurting the ability, for instance, of Latinos to buy houses? Because you have the policies where it's very hard to develop, and then you're requiring this, and this. And he said, well, climate change is more important. So, literally the fate of the working class and the middle class in America is much less important to the environmentalists than some sort of virtue signaling. And what's funny about it is the biggest reductions in GHG in this country have come from states that are actually fairly conservative and are, in many cases, energy producers. But they've gone from coal to natural gas. The biggest reductions in GHG are coal to natural gas.
Yeah.
And to give President Obama credit, he never went against natural gas. Steve Koonin, who was his advisor on energy, he also said, you want to have natural gas replace coal as much as you can do it. You could replace gasoline with natural gas.
Yes, you could.
And
it might be better than electric cars.
It would get you where you wanted to go faster. But what's happened is, and this is my sort of cynical left-wing way of looking at the world a little bit, which is when I said, well, look, think about all the interests that are now lined up on Wall Street in particular on green energy. It's the great opportunity for them. You can replace an entire part of the economy with a part that's not very efficient, is very expensive, but you're guaranteed profits.
Yeah, at the expense of taxpayers.
Right.
Because of the subsidies. A lot of it's rent seeking.
Unbelievable amounts of rents. I mean, basically, I was talking to an attorney who works on these cases. He says, right now, if you invest in green energy, you're pretty well guaranteed about a 7% return per year, no matter what.
One of the most staggering things that I've seen, Joel, in my own country is, and I suspect it's happening internationally, is that in my days in government, any significant policy development, even quite minor ones really, which would have had financial impacts, would have been modelled to death by Treasury and Finance departments before they came along.
Well, you were in the cabinet, so you know how that works.
It doesn't seem to be happening anymore at all. Ideology is pipping clear thinking.
Yeah, I think that's... I think of the policies like, I'll give Jason Furman again, who was the advisor of President Obama. He said this bill that they just passed, and then the huge college loan bailout. He said you're throwing gasoline on the fire.
Yeah.
You're going to bring billions of dollars without any production, without so you're going to raise the prices of everything,
and you're not forgiving debt. You're simply transferring it to someone else.
Right. Well,
and this is coming from somebody. I'm not a climate change skeptic. I'm a farmer. I actually think, apart from anything else, fossil fuels in the end are finite. We do need to pursue technologies. We do need to pursue alternatives. But the point is this: if we do it in ways that weaken and permanently damage our economies, unfairly hit the poor or the less well off, reduce food production, what we're going to end up with is a massive transfer of power and influence and capacity to shape the world away from the Western democracies.
Well,
Europe comes to mind at the moment.
I mean, I always use this term when I talk about energy policy in China. If you remember Muhammad Ali, he had this idea of the rope-a-dope. Let George Foreman or Joe Frazier spend all this energy. He's dancing around, and when they're tired, he goes and attacks them.
Yeah.
This is exactly what China is doing. They're sitting there watching us systematically destroy our economy, destroy our education system. And the way we're going in 30 years, Europe and California and Australia will be places where wealthy Chinese and Indians go to vacate. That's what we will have essentially no real role in the world economy. I look at the UK as a danger for US, and I think also for Australia. What makes Australia and the US stronger than the UK is the amount of land, the natural resources that they can feed themselves. I mean, look, if the whole world trade economy ended tomorrow, Australia and the United States would be two countries that would come out best.
Yeah, well, as long as we were still free to run our own affairs.
Right.
All of that taken. Yeah, all right.
But now what we're doing is we're surrendering that.
Yeah.
And we're allowing another country to, in particular, to essentially take control of the world economy. And, frankly, I don't think Wall Street gives a damn as long as they make money. I really, the biggest defenders of China right now are the tech companies and Wall Street.
It's very sobering. Now, in the face of these enormous challenges, to come back to something we were talking about earlier, I worry that we, one way or another, are discouraging our children, the ones we ought to be really committed to helping on the way.
Yes.
And you're on the front line of educating people here at this university, so you've actually been writing about it a bit. You've recently documented an alarming trend of millennials, or those born between 1980 and 2000, effectively dropping out
yes.
of social and civic life, men in particular. Can you give us a feel for what you're seeing and what you think might be driving it?
Well, I think some of it is this sense of hopelessness, which is partially the climate change. I think globally it's like half of young people think the world is not going to be here in 10 years. I mean, you don't teach people history.
This is not what the scientists are saying.
Of course not.
Even the gloomiest scientists, predictors, are not saying we're going to starve. They're saying it's going to be rougher, it's going to be wilder, it might be harder to handle. They're not saying it's going to come to an end. That's the politicians and the media,
right? And
the tech billionaires,
right? Well, because it's good for them, So I mean, I think what's happened is we also have not taught the kids the values of Western civilization. I was talking to a student the other day, and she said, "Well, I'm going to take a class on Shakespeare, but it's Shakespeare and race." And I said, "Well, don't you think first of all, you're talking about somebody who never met a Jew, never met a black person, probably in his entire life. England at that time was, as the Germans would say, Judenfrei. Shakespeare has got so much more to say than to focus on that issue."
Yeah.
And particularly because many of these students have never really studied Shakespeare.
No.
But we now have a situation where there are major universities where you can get a degree in English without having studied Shakespeare. The guy invented the language. I mean, basically, I don't understand how you do it. It's just like when I was a student in Latin, bizarrely enough. If you didn't reach Virgil, you couldn't possibly think that you knew Latin, because Virgil was the leading poet of the Roman period. So what we're doing is we're taking from our kids all the joy and all the accomplishments. Yes, there were horrible things that happened, but you know what? For every Jefferson Davis, you've got a Frederick Douglass. You've got, there's a lot to be very proud of in this country. When people say, well, this is a hopelessly racist country, I said, you know what? 600,000 Americans died over the issue of slavery, basically.
And you've had a black president elected twice.
Right. And African Americans are a very prominent part of this society.
Can I put a really, and this is not meant to sound offensive at all, but it's a genuine question. Is there a country that a black person would have more opportunity in the world today than in America? Well,
it all depends. I suppose if you were very well educated African American and you moved to Norway, probably, they'd be so happy to have you that it might do well. But for the average African American, I think the African American economy is about the size of sub-Saharan Africa.
So that's my point.
The Hispanic population in the United States is by far the wealthiest population. The African population in the United States is by far the wealthiest population. And by the way, Africans, have done pretty well in some cases in the UK as well. So I think that what we forget is, yes, there have been disadvantages, but we've made such an enormous transformation.
But Black Lives Matter never seems to obsess about some of the terrible things that are happening in places like Nigeria.
Oh, yeah.
Where many blacks live in daily fear of their lives. As a proportion of the population, it's tragically high, the number of people who are not safe.
Right, well, but you see,
let alone have no economic opportunities.
I mean, and that's why I think that part of what we need to do is we need to say, hey, look, yes, this country's had a lot of bad things that have happened over time. You had the experience with the Aborigines. We had the experience with the Native Americans. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, and slavery, there are terrible things. But think about what this country is like now. Like, I said to my girls, I said, my kids, I'm old enough to remember when I went to Virginia with my parents in 1960, that there were colored-only hotels. I remember asking my father, I said, what is that? Because, we didn't have that in New York. And when my kids said, no, that couldn't have been, I said, you don't understand. You didn't see black people on TV. You didn't see, some of the sports didn't really integrate until the 50s. I mean, but think about where we are now. I said, if a time traveler from 1960 came to the United States today, they would be astounded by the diversity, not just relative to African Americans, but Hispanics, Middle Eastern, Asian, of all different kinds. This is a vastly different country, and it's got enormous potential. So I want to at least make some positive statements. I'm working on a story right now for the City Journal in New York about restaurants that did well out of COVID and came out of it. Every single one is either Asian or Hispanic, and then you see what they're doing with their food, where they're bringing in influences from Mexico and combining them with influences from the Middle East. I mean, they're just fantastic possibilities. And a society like Canada, Australia, United States, the UK, to some extent New Zealand, have this capacity to create a new kind of culture.
But isn't that the point? That we're decrying the institutions of our freedoms, partly because so many people in them behave so badly that we don't trust them anymore. But the democracies have been the systems that have been able to say, even at horrific costs like the Civil War, this is not right. We've got to correct this. And if we're going to give up on democracies being the best way to evolve change when something's unfair, what are we going to resort to? Because none of the autocratic or the feudal sort of societies that you've been writing about ever work out very well for those who are at the bottom of the pile.
And look, where do immigrants want to go? I mean, they're all going. They're going to they're going to France, they're going to England, they're going to Australia, they're going to the United States, they're going to Canada, because those are free societies. And I sometimes find that my immigrant friends are much more aware of the value of this society than the second, third, fourth generation.
Yes. That's certainly true in Australia.
Yes, yes.
They're often the people who'll say quietly when you get into a cab and the driver, has been from Eastern Europe or something, they'll just quietly say, I'm really uncomfortable about something. I can see where that's drifting. Why can't Australians see it?
And particularly if you're coming from Eastern Europe, or you're coming from, some repressive environment, and you start seeing the government starting to censor speech, or like during the lockdowns where you couldn't do anything. I mean, one of the things that I think we need to understand is that there is a resentment to all this against all this control. It just doesn't have really a voice.
Yeah.
I mean, and unfortunately, the only voice that gets associated with that dissent is Trump. That's why Biden is desperate to paint the entire opposition to his policies with Trump, because Trump is the best thing the Democrats have going for them.
Yeah, but at what cost? I mean, the attacks on the Americans who have vented let's put it this way, as I see it, Trump may have been a divisive figure in some ways, but he was more the product of division.
I agree totally.
So
He should never have gotten that far.
Biden, the President Biden, it seems to me, if I can be so bold as an outsider, has talked a bit about reunifying the country, but he's just launched, as we said here, the most extraordinary attack.
And this has been
he says it's only the MAGA Republicans, but then the speech goes on to make it plain it's basically all Republicans. Well, that's a huge slab of your fellow Americans.
And the greatest irony here is the Democrats have been funding extreme MAGA candidates against moderate Republicans.
That's just, well, I shouldn't say it's blanket, it's corrupt, but it looks that's pretty cynical.
It's very, I mean, their hope is we'll run against these lunatic Trumpistas and we'll beat them. Now, what'll end up is we'll end up with at least a few of those lunatics in the Congress. Just what we need is another group of lunatics.
Back to the disengagement by young people. This sort of dropping out. This is the age of disengagement.
Yes, definitely.
My listeners will have heard me say this before, but Lord Sumption on one of these conversations commented that in the 50s and 60s in Britain, the Labor Party and the Conservatives between them had more grassroots members, had around 3 million grassroots members. Today, the Royal Society of Birdwatchers in Britain has more members than the political parties combined.
Really? That's
and in the countries where voting's not compulsory, huge numbers just never turn out, and particularly young people hardly ever bother. Well, not hardly, but many of them don't even register.
No, look, it's.
Are they giving up, seriously giving up on our culture?
Yeah, I think they're just disengaged. I mean, there are a lot of factors, like everything. There's many factors. Yeah. Certainly, one of them is social media. You know, they're diverted into, you know, into this fake world. And I'll tell you, I'm working right now. We're doing a big conference here on the metaverse, and you ain't seen nothing yet. If you think video games and social media are bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. What's coming is infinitely more immersive. Now, there may be some very good things that the metaverse can do, but the metaverse is basically virtual reality. The inventor of the technology was right from here in Orange County, and then was bought by Facebook. And I was on the phone with the guy who's doing their economics. They're talking about trillions of dollars. And basically what it is you put on, now, at least now, you put on a headset, and it's like a video game, but it's much more immersive and completely engaging. And, you know, the potential for whatever sort of fantasy you have is pretty overwhelming. And so the idea would be long term, you're going to have a population which spends an enormous amount of its time online. I mean, and it's inexorable because the oligarchic companies have an interest in having you spend more and more of your time online, because they make, you know, that's how they make their fortune. So the metaverse, I think, is going to be the big game changer. It's going to be where we're headed, where we're going to see that, you know, where people spend the vast majority of their time online. And it's because right now, even video games are not quite that immersive. I mean, they are to some extent. I think you're talking about going in and essentially creating your own reality. Like, you don't have to have kids. You can have a kid in the metaverse.
Well, we know that big, heavy usage of pornography can desensitize people and take them out of the capacity to relate to others properly.
Right.
What does this have the potential to do in terms of damage
just
to
intensify that and make it more alluring. And
so you can have all the adrenaline rush, the dopamine impact and so forth of intimate relationships with not another human in sight.
Right, except artificial humans.
Well, yeah.
And then obviously down the road, like what we're looking at here, is that eventually more and more things will be done by robots. I mean, you know, you can see what the future that's being laid out in front of us is going to be like. And one of the very few advantages of being an old guy is that I won't be here to see most of it.
That's a pretty sad thing to say if you're trying to fire up your students.
Well, I hope that I have more hope for them. I think in that I think that if they're presented with a different way of thinking, and I always tell them, I don't care what your politics are. I'm going to grade you on how well you write and how you back up your arguments. That's all I care about. But think about the different sides of things. Think about, that if you do A, it's going to cause B. And then maybe you should still do A, but you ought to know that there are going to be these negatives. Like, this idea that you're going to move, let's say, to electrical vehicles and everything will be great. Well, that's, there's going to be a lot of pain along the way and basically, particular people will feel it more than others. But I still believe that ultimately young people are not stupid. They're not. I mean, I find the kids I teach, they're smart. They're technologically, much better than me. They know how to. They really. I think there is this interest. I think the Z's, the next generation, will be better than the millennials, and I think the millennials will become more conservative over time as they start thinking about buying a house and look, that's what's happening. When we look at who's leaving California, it's young middle class families. That's who's leaving, because you can't buy a house here. I mean, how do you buy a house in a state where, if you on the coastal counties, you're talking about minimal $700,000-800,000 US for a very modest home in an area where, if you have children, you're probably going to send them to private school. So you don't move to Texas for the weather. You don't move to Texas for the food. You don't move, although there is some good food there, but you don't move to Texas for the topography. I mean, there's no question California is infinitely nicer than Texas. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, there's just no way.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, but I can. So, but in Texas, there's opportunity. And in Texas, there's some idea of at least some protection of your basic rights. Now, the problem that Texas has is it has a far right that has its own agenda, which isn't so great. But for people when they're moving, if I can move to a nice suburb of Dallas and buy a house for $450,000 instead of $800,000, and I'm in an area where I can send my kids to the public school, it's a kind of a no-brainer. And what you do is in the middle of the summer, you go and spend a month in California.
Final question. You come from what you would call the pragmatic centre. Any thoughts on what might bring this country back together, given that it's divided from top to bottom at the moment, and that threatens its coherence, and therefore, frankly, the liberal global order that it's overseen since the end of the Second World War?
One of my biggest disappointments with President Biden has been that he didn't do that, as you pointed out, and he's chosen to become extraordinarily divisive. The whole Green New Deal, like, what are you doing? Why are you threatening so many people's lives? Why are you? Obviously, there was not a lot of significant analysis of the fiscal impacts. I think that there are politicians in both parties who conceivably could make a difference. I'm thinking particularly of Youngkin in Virginia, Hogan in Maryland. I mean, there are several of these politicians who are out there and have been very successful. It's just that the national media and the national political establishment has been pushing things on the extreme. Like, if I see a Republican who's willing to impeach Trump for January 6th, I'm much more likely to vote for that Republican than a Republican who's going to back a guy who clearly does. I mean, my sense with Trump is he's not a fascist. He doesn't have enough coherency in his worldview to be a fascist. He didn't govern as a fascist. But I think what we are having is a kind of fascism, but almost a sort of melding of feudalism and fascism, but it's coming more from the left than the right. But there is an element in the right that is scary. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, what bothers me is liberals don't see the threat from the established government side, and the conservatives don't see the threat from, from their far right. They just, how do you take January 6th and dismiss it? It was a very serious issue. Talking about, hanging the vice president, that's pretty bad. I'm sorry. And there's no really excuse there. But I do think people, maybe after the horrible secession of Trump and then Biden, maybe we'll find something different. We've managed out of those situations before. We've very often, even when the country's been very divided, eventually we do find ways of coping with it. The basic constitutional structure is still very good. And I think people want stuff that works. And then the question is, how do we communicate that? How do we get it? Like right now, the problem is, like someone like me, I end up writing mostly for conservative publications because the liberal publications aren't going to listen to what I'm saying because it doesn't follow the party line. The sort of Stalinization of particularly of the liberal media is pretty astounding. I mean, and that's why you have people like Bill Maher, who are saying, hey, look, right now the progressives are the most boring, intolerant, unfunny group of people out there.
They're certainly unfunny. You're seeing that in Britain. Britain's always been known, particularly in Australia where we understand British humour, for their comedians. They're genuinely funny people, setting themselves up. Some of them are literally leaving Britain. They're saying there's no room for humour anymore.
Well, the same thing in this country. Try to watch a Woody Allen movie or a Mel Brooks movie or Richard Pryor movie. Those movies you can't. They're going to have things in them that Dave Chappelle. There's lots of these guys out there, and you can't say this, you can't say that. Well, humor is all about making fun. I mean, and you can't do that anymore. And could you imagine Blazing Saddles being made today? I don't think so. And yet, Blazing Saddles, actually, Mel Brooks is very liberal, and the point of view is very liberal, but it's funny, and he makes fun of things that involve race. The humorlessness is just, it's so terrible. And when was the last time there was a really good comedy?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it's matched only by the mercilessness of the judgments. If you accidentally sent off a tripwire, there's no forgiveness. And I don't know how any culture works. The smallest culture, a family, right through to a nation works if you can't forgive and forget.
Well, and I think that's also part of the problem. And sometimes they dredge up something that somebody tweeted 10 years ago or or had a posting that was, and look, I mean, young people do stupid things. I don't think there's any of us older people who didn't do something stupid when we were young, something that we're sorry we did, or something we said that we wouldn't say today. So we're going to say, hey, I'm going to, because I said something about, gay people 20 years ago, I'm a horrible person and therefore can't be, can't even be allowed in the public square. That's the kind of world we're headed towards. It's the kind of world that it's up to us, to try to stop.
Well, you make a magnificent contribution. I recommend your writings to anybody who hasn't come across them. Really appreciate your time. You've been very kind.
Well, my pleasure.